Welcome to Altera Vista. I'm Lisa Ledwidge with the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. I'm here with Kristin Dawkins. She's the director of the Global Governance Program at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're going to talk today about sustainable development and the United Nations World Summit on that topic, which is coming up in Johannesburg, South Africa, August 26th through September 4th, 2002. Tens of thousands of people will converge for the Johannesburg Summit, including leaders from more than 100 countries, non-governmental organizations, and business people, and they'll evaluate progress from the Earth Summit held 10 years ago in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And they'll try to reach agreements on things like how the world will meet ever-increasing demands for food, water, shelter, sanitation, energy, health services, and economic security. Kristin Dawkins participated in the Rio Summit 10 years ago, and she leaves for Johannesburg in 2 weeks for the World Summit on Sustainable Development. She's also the author of a book called Gene Wars, The Politics of Biotechnology, and she's currently working on a book on global governance, Why Communities Matter. And Kristin, I want to ask you, we'll be talking about the World Summit on Sustainable Development today, but take us back 10 years ago to the Rio Summit and kind of give us a context for how this all started.
It was a very exciting time. It was the first of a series of UN conferences where they really invited people, just regular citizens from all over the world, to join in. And so it was a governmental negotiation where more than 100 government leaders would sit down and try to map out priorities and decisions about how they would change their own behavior, the behavior of the companies that operate within their borders, and the behavior of the citizens, the laws that direct our behavior, in a way that would make the world more sustainable. That was certainly the goal. And there were some 50,000, I guess, people actually who went to Rio de Janeiro, and for the first time really got engaged in the whole international policy-making arena. It tends to be kind of mysterious, the UN, all these global treaties, free trade. People don't really understand how that works, except that they know it's affecting their lives and their access to jobs, their ability to breathe clean air and drink clean water. But how do those decisions get made? That was the first, as I said, of a series of conferences that since then have had tens of thousands of people going to a variety of cities around the world to watch and speak with these government leaders as they're going about the negotiations. I think it's been a very healthy development in terms of democracy for all people on Earth, and I think it's also been very helpful towards mapping out a future that will be sustainable for our children. The Earth Summit itself, however, has not really turned out to be the success we had hoped at that time, because all too many governments, and I'll point the finger straight at the United States government first, haven't really fulfilled the commitments that they made in Rio. Basically, there were three major things that happened. Maybe we could say four. One is an Earth Charter, which was just a declaration about what we believe in and how the world could be, a visionary statement about what we would like to see for the future of the planet. The second document was something called Agenda 21, and it isn't really law, it isn't really a legal international treaty, but it did create a plan of action for handling all kinds of the resources, fresh water and sanitation services, and the different kinds of creatures in the oceans and in the forests, and rainforests in specific, and just a whole long list of different ecosystems and different problems and what we would hopefully do about it. But it was more of a discussion document than actual law. Then they created two new international treaties. One was on climate change, and over the decade they have negotiated several more specific protocols, they call them, that would be serious, binding law that all of the nations participating would be expected to comply with. The Kyoto Protocol is the one that we've heard the most about. A couple of years ago, they actually agreed to a set of targets and timetables. That's language that means by XYZ year, that's the timetable, they will reduce carbon dioxide emissions in their own countries. Our governments are taking the responsibility of reducing carbon dioxide emissions in each of their own countries by a certain percentage. And they argued about the percentages, and they said the industrialized countries, which are consuming so much, like the United States, ought to reduce more. And the developing countries, who really need to have more industry and other sorts of development occurring, need to have access to greater uses of fossil fuels, which create the carbon dioxide when they are burned. So those were the kinds of negotiations. Now, unfortunately, the United States government never participated in the Rio Treaty on climate change, got involved in the Kyoto negotiations, but backed out and never completed that process. And to date, the United States, as well as some of the other countries in the world, are really not complying with the goal of the Earth Summit. The second major international new law was on biodiversity, which is a term that refers to all life on Earth and the web of life and how species interact and how we all depend on each other. And it's not just the chain of food, where we eat cows and cows eat grass and grass depends on microorganisms, although that's part of it. But it's really a much greater interdependence, where take these sunflowers. If you don't breed these sunflowers, which create birdseed, and with other sunflowers that might create the kind of sunflowers that we can buy at the store to nibble on, with other sunflowers that really don't maybe produce any commercial product at all, just like with people, if other plants and animals and microorganisms don't interbreed, then they produce offspring in the next generation that aren't really viable. Just as with people, if cousins intermarry, you might have children with birth defects. So the Biodiversity Treaty was designed to lay out a whole series of activities governments should undertake to ensure that all of the gene pool of the Earth is protected, so that this kind of breeding, whether it's for actually commercially producing sunflowers or pork or wheat or what other products we need to eat, the same with the interaction of all of the gene pool for the species in nature that create the underlying bioactivity, the ecosystems, the interaction of all the different species that some of our scientists have yet to discover what their significance really is, but we know that we are all interdependent. So that was the fourth product, the second international treaty, and that one is another one that the United States has never subscribed to.
Before we get too far along on what happened at the Rio Summit 10 years ago, I want to show you a video as well as our audience. It's about 6 minutes long. It's a speech made by Severn Cullis Suzuki, who's with the Environmental Children's Organization at the Rio Summit 10 years ago, to the country delegates. And let's watch that video and then we'll come back to our conversation.
Hello, I'm Severn Suzuki, speaking for ECHO, the Environmental Children's Organization. We're a group of 12 and 13-year-olds trying to make a difference. Vanessa Setti, Morgan Geisler, Michelle Quigg, and me. We've raised all the money to come here ourselves, to come 5,000 miles to tell you adults you must change your ways. Coming up here today, I have no hidden agenda. I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am here to speak for all generations to come. I am here to speak on behalf of the starving children around the world whose cries go unheard. I am here to speak for the countless animals dying across this planet because they have nowhere left to go. I am afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in our ozone. I am afraid to breathe the air because I don't know what chemicals are in it. I used to go fishing in Vancouver, my home, with my dad, until just a few years ago we found the fish full of cancers. And now we hear of animals and plants going extinct every day, vanishing forever. In my life, I have dreamt of seeing the great herds of wild animals, jungles and rainforests full of birds and butterflies. But now I wonder if they will even exist for my children to see. Did you have to worry of these things when you were my age? All this is happening before our eyes, and yet we act as if we have all the time we want and all the solutions. I'm only a child, and I don't have all the solutions. But I want you to realize, neither do you. You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert. If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it. Here, you may be delegates of your government, business people, organizers, reporters, or politicians, but really, your mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles, and all of you are someone's child. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all in this together and should act as one single world towards one single goal. In my country, we make so much waste. We buy and throw away, and yet northern countries will not share with the needy. Even when we have more than enough, we are afraid to share. We are afraid to let go of some of our wealth. In Canada, we live the privileged life, with plenty of food, water, and shelter. We have watches, bicycles, computers, and television sets. The list could go on for 2 days. 2 days ago, here in Brazil, we were shocked when we spent time with some children living on the streets. This is what one child told us. I wish I was rich. And if I were, I would give all the street children food, clothes, medicines, shelter, and love and affection. If a child on the streets who has nothing is willing to share, why are we who have everything still so greedy? I can't stop thinking that these are children my own age, that it makes a tremendous difference where you are born. I am only a child, yet I know if all the money spent on war was spent on finding environmental answers, ending poverty, and finding treaties, what a wonderful place this earth would be. At school, even in kindergarten, you teach us how to behave in the world. You teach us not to fight with others, to work things out, to respect others, to clean up our mess, not to hurt other creatures, to share, not be greedy. Then why do you go out and do the things you tell us not to do? Do not forget why you are attending these conferences, who you're doing this for. We are your own children. You are deciding what kind of a world we are growing up in. Parents should be able to comfort their children by saying, everything's going to be all right. It's not the end of the world, and we're doing the best we can. But I don't think you can say that to us anymore. Are we even on your list of priorities? My dad always says, you are what you do, not what you say. Well, what you do makes me cry at night. You grown-ups say you love us, but I challenge you, please, make your actions reflect your words. Thank you.
So, Kristin, have the adults changed their ways as Severn implored?
I wish I could say yes, and certainly many individuals have. But in terms of an overall pattern of change, I'm afraid that the planet is in worse shape than it was 10 years ago. And our governments, and again I will point the finger at our own, have really not been very responsive to her challenge. The situation with hunger actually is somewhat better, and poverty as well, on a worldwide scale. The UN did just issue a new report showing for the first time that trends are generally improving for hunger and poverty globally. But there's a catch here, and that is that about 90% of all of that improvement, which was enough to change the whole global statistic, came from China. So in most parts of the world, and Africa in particular, hunger is actually worse, poverty is actually worse than it was 10 years ago. On the environmental side, it's all worse. Global warming has increased, carbon dioxide emissions globally are up. Most of that is coming from the United States. Europe has held has actually gone down a little bit. Japan has held steady. Those are the big emitters of carbon dioxide, so we are really the culprits here in this country. Global warming is causing a lot of problems around the world. It's an argument, you can have over the dinner table whether the current drought throughout the Midwest here is due to global warming or just a cyclical pattern.
And we're hearing about the severe weather in Eastern Europe, and Prague is now flooded.
Yeah, I think in most...
China's having major flooding.
Places.
Lots of people are dying because of it.
Yep, you can see very unusual weather patterns almost anywhere. Yeah. And forests are in decline. The world's lost something like 4% of its forests on an annual basis every year since Rio. In Africa, again, that statistic is worse as people in desperation are going into the forests and cutting them down for firewood and other survival purposes. It's a problem in our fisheries. The availability of seafood that hasn't been farmed is in decline. A lot of different types of fish that used to be available in large numbers are now harder and harder to catch, sending out bigger boats deeper into the ocean to try to mine the depths. These are all indications that the planet is not improving whatsoever, and scientists suggest that there may be a point at which in any one of these cases, whether you're talking fish or forests or the quality of the air or ozone depletion or global warming or what have you, that while each of them are getting worse, there could possibly be a point at which that all comes together and we have some kind of a catastrophic multiple failures of all the systems that enable survival. It's unknown, it's speculative, but it's something that science understands is possible.
What hopes do you have for the upcoming World Summit on Sustainable Development, August 22nd through September 4th, 2002?
My hope will be that a lot of people come, that some of the gravest problems in terms of human health become highlighted. 10 years ago, there wasn't as much talk about the impact on humans. It was about wildlife, it was about forests and fisheries. I think 10 years later, as we watch the continuing decline, we're much more conscious of it, that it's affecting our own personal health. Some 3 million kids die every year now of air pollution. And this is a new type of statistic that enters the discussion. The water policies, we're not talking about oceans and whales as much as we're talking about the fact that 1 billion people don't have clean drinking water to drink. This is causing diarrhea and other infectious diseases in children and contributing to a lot of there's a decline in child mortality, a worsening of child mortality, for example, and this is due to the lack of public health services in so much of the world. I think that's probably the AIDS epidemic is yet another example where people are increasingly conscious that environmental problems are really human health problems. And I think that that will be what it takes to really force us all to look much harder and make deeper commitments to change.
And what are the prospects for achieving some of the, kind of overcoming some of these challenges for this World Summit on Sustainable Development? What do you think is going to happen?
By September 4th in Johannesburg, I believe we will have some kind of an agreement on the drinking water issue. That's the one that is progressing the best. I believe that there will be a commitment by governments to cut in half the number of people who, I said 1 billion, so 500 million people, hopefully, by the year 2015, will be getting drinking water services that didn't have it before. This, I think, will be a commitment. Whether they're able to keep that commitment in 13 years is another problem altogether. But I feel there is enough political will on the drinking water and also on the sanitation issues, providing sanitation services in the urban areas to reduce by half the number of people who presently don't have those. That would be my most optimistic scenario.
Yeah. Now, you talked about the United States. What is the role of the United States here? What do you expect will happen? And then also, kind of try to explain to us why the U.S. is being so obstructive on things like the Kyoto Protocol on climate change and some other issues.
The United States, I'm sorry to say, is most responsive to the corporate lobby. Just as we've seen with Enron and other examples, the largest corporations are very closely connected to our political system. And the climate change issue is really one that the oil industry, the coal, and the rest of the energy sector don't want to see changed because it is their bottom line. They make money when they burn when the rest of us burn fossil fuels. And the goal at Johannesburg, put forward by many countries to try to implement the climate change recommendations, has been to shift the energy supply from fossil fuels to some percentage of renewable sources. And again, setting a target, what that percentage might be, and a timetable by a certain year. Unfortunately, those negotiations aren't going anywhere near as well. The energy lobby is not only very powerful in Washington, D.C., but it's very powerful throughout the world. And the OPEC countries are actually leading much of the discussion on this issue and have managed to limit the likelihood that there will be any real positive new targets and timetables on energy policy. But the bigger question, corporate influence overall, I think is actually the reason why the Rio commitments haven't been kept to a great extent, and certainly why our government is not actively participating. Also on the Biodiversity Treaty, which I mentioned that we haven't been we haven't ratified that treaty yet. It's being held up in our Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The reason there is that the major agribusiness companies and the large ranching firms have said that this would force them to change the way they do business. And by the way, there was also a memo leaked from our then Vice President Dan Quayle's office saying that that treaty would also require us in the United States to change our laws regarding indigenous peoples and give them greater rights than our present United States policy.
And that was viewed as a negative?
And that was one of the reasons why the Bush administration of 1992, the first Bush administration, was unwilling to sign the Biodiversity Treaty. So we have indigenous peoples' rights on the one hand, we have the protection of species and the gene pool, and then we have those large agribusiness concerns which are benefiting by their control of the different types of crops and animals that form our food supply, that they don't want to give up that control.
Now, is the United States doing anything good in terms of sustainable development and following up on its Rio commitments and being proactive in working for sustainable development at the coming Johannesburg summit? Can we say anything good about the United States?
Boy, if I really scratch my head, I would have to say that as a government in these governmental negotiations, the answer is no. On the other hand, I think that the people of the United States are very soft-hearted and very willing to do what it takes to try to save children from these horrendous deaths. And we've seen a great deal of change in behavior among people. The state of California recently issued an ultimatum, new legislation requiring the automakers in California to lower the emissions from automobiles, and the likelihood that the big automakers will respond nationwide, because the number of cars in California that get sold is so great, it's easier for them to change the entire production line than simply to change the types of cars they would sell in one state, even though it's a big state. So I think we'll see a national change coming from the auto industry in response to the California legislators coming from the California people. This is, I think, a positive sign and something that we need to do more of throughout the country.
So we can say good things in terms of sustainable development and working proactively for the World Summit in terms of the people of the United States, but not necessarily the administration. What about Congress of the United States? Are there any champions or especially bad people? And also, how are our Minnesota legislators coming in on this issue, if at all?
Congress is a very different bag. There are certainly wonderful environmentalists and wonderful advocates for health policy and children and so forth. We're caught, though, in very partisan politics with our two-party system. The Democrats and Republicans are very, very close, as we know, in both houses, and they end up having to really be very careful about when they go out on a limb on a particular issue in order to both bring the whole party along for some of the major victories. Drug policy, for example, was one of the big ones this last session. Or, at the same time, to win re-election, and for that they need big money. And then the corporate lobby steps back in. So I happen to believe that campaign finance reform, and really significant campaign finance reform, is one of the first things that we need to achieve in our Congress if we're ever going to get an opportunity for the advocates of a better policy along any one of these lines to really have the freedom to stand up and make their points. The Minnesota delegation, though, all in all, is better than average, and I would certainly say that our current senators are doing a very good job on a lot of these issues.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the United States and mainly the United States government in relation to the World Summit on Sustainable Development, but there are many other actors here. There are non-governmental organizations, NGOs, there are business people. You have participated in the Rio Summit 10 years ago, and you'll participate in the WSSD this in 2 weeks as a representative of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which is an NGO. And I want you to tell me about other organizations that you work with, and there's going to be tens of thousands of people that are coming to this summit. Who are they, and what groups are they from? And tell me about these other actors.
Sure, there are certainly, if there are tens of thousands of people, there's probably 5,000 organizations that will be there represented, covering the gamut from the children's group that we saw Severn in the video representing. There are quite a few children's groups that actually end up sending delegates and participating in that sense. There's a lot of environmental groups. Some of the big ones would include the National Wildlife Federation or the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. Oxfam is a big group. There's a number of Catholic charities, and ActionAid, which is a group based in the church community of Great Britain with branches all over the world. A lot of different religious organizations, a lot of farm groups and consumer organizations, and really it's the whole wide labor union side. Let me not forget them. There's just an enormous array of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And as I say, the UN has been increasingly open to including them in this type of meetings, and we've learned that sending good, strong delegations really can make a difference. The business community, though, has also become more and more active over the years in these negotiations, and in many cases they are also very behind closed doors invited into some of the deliberations, or governments will invite them to actually sit in on their official delegations representing the United States of America or the European Union or the other governments.
Will they invite NGOs?
They have as well, but in general it's been in smaller percentages and fewer numbers, all told. But that's an important trend in democracy as well. I think that overall the democratization of the international system is something that is improving in spite of the grimness in the other aspects, the open door policy, and really encouraging all of us to come and have our say and make our contributions. The business community has been very successful in its access, though, to the governments. The Johannesburg meeting has really put forward kind of a whole new approach to addressing environmental and social problems that many NGOs find to be problematic. By that, I mean that they are saying that it is the corporate sector that will actually provide the drinking water and the sanitation services and the drugs needed for the AIDS virus and all the social ills the corporations are saying, and the governments and UN are going along in agreeing that the corporations can solve many of these problems. And that's going to end up in a couple of different things. At least one would be the shift of public resources to the private sector. So a national government using taxpayer dollars might end up subsidizing a water company to come in and put in a pipeline for a village to get fresh water in faucets and then haul the waste out through toilets. This turns into a profitable venture for the corporations. It does provide services for large numbers of people, to be sure, but we've moved very scarce public dollars into the treasury of the private companies. Also, the second problem I would point to here is that the companies, because they are profit-making enterprises, will still not go where there isn't a profit to be had. So if there's an inadequate subsidy on the part of a government, and if the poor are simply too poor to pay the fees that are then charged them to use the water or to pay into a public, or in this case the privatized waste system, then the companies won't go there. And this is true in rural areas especially, where it's simply too far away from the millions of people who might live in an urban center, And so the poorest of the poor who tend to live in rural areas are still not going to be served by this new trend of partnering with the corporate sector to provide public services.
So what would be the better alternative for helping these people who don't have sanitary water and who don't have sewage systems? I think there's probably a lot of people in the viewing audience who would say, well, that's good that the corporations are going in there and they're building them things, and, well, too bad they're being charged for it, but there's obviously a better solution.
For the very poor, there are several different approaches. One is that scarce public dollars should simply be invested in providing the public service and developing a public utility system, which is in most places around the United States. We're still providing water and sewage services through our municipalities. And that means that sure, we're all paying tax dollars and we may be subsidizing the very poor, but those resources are not being taken by a private company to a bank in New York City or offshore or in Switzerland. So we're recycling the dollars that are available within our local municipalities to continue to provide these services over time. That's one factor that's different. In terms of the very remote rural areas, well, it's not that long ago that many suburbs were connected to the public systems anyway. And so we all remember the septic tank approach and the wells that are still in many cases where we get our water. Unfortunately, that well water is all too often polluted nowadays, but it is still possible to provide very decentralized sanitation and drinking water without plugging into a massive reservoir system.
You know, this kind of reminds me of what Severn mentioned, that we need to do more sharing and there needs to be a lot less greed in the world. And she kind of pitted it as a sharing versus greedy dynamic. And it also sort of reminds me of the idea that I've been hearing of lately where corporations are receiving more rights than we as individuals are, than as the very people that are made up our country and our world. Does this resonate with you at all?
Oh, very much so. I can certainly relate to the passion with which she spoke, and a great number of people from the NGO community would also echo those same sentiments. The greed factor and the imbalance between social policy and commercial policy is also seen in the way that the free trade agreements and the investment policies, the attempts to limit the way that governments manage the financial system and the way that the governments manage trade and corporate behavior across borders, those are going gung-ho. You know, our administration in Washington, whether we were talking about the Democrats under Clinton or the Republicans under either Bush administration, all of them have said free trade is the way to go. And what free trade really means is freeing up the corporations to do business with a minimum of government regulation. So what we are getting now is meat that is getting recalled because it's full of E. coli. We're getting a variety of health risks in our food system. We're losing jobs. A lot of labor had lost jobs in the last 6-7 years since NAFTA took effect, the North America Free Trade Agreement. And they were told that, oh, well, you know, too bad for you, North American labor, but the Mexicans are going to really benefit from all of these jobs. Well, that hasn't turned out to be the case. There was a short-term boost in employment in Mexico, but a lot of those jobs were in places where the families had to relocate, leaving the women and children at home, or the with the breadwinner, whether it was a male or a female, going into these what they call maquila factories, and state-of-the-art factory, but right outside the door they were dumping the toxic waste from the production system right there. There were a lot of health problems resulting from that. Talking about sanitation and clean water again, the shanty towns that sprang up around these maquila factories didn't have sanitation or clean water for these workers. And now, 6 or 7 years later, we're finding that most of the companies that relocated to Mexico to take advantage of the cheaper labor there and the fewer regulations are now picking up again and moving to other countries, particularly China. So there's a continuous effect here of lowering standards for workers, human health, and the environment, while the companies continue to get the additional financial benefit from that extra margin that they don't have to pay if they were going to be hiring U.S. workers with our stronger laws. And it continues to just sort of percolate through the system.
And were these some of the consequences of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA?
Yes, although also globally, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, took effect a year after NAFTA, but we're finding many of the same results that are now being spread throughout the world are what we can see a little closer to home here as a result of NAFTA. Something like 30 million agricultural families have lost their jobs worldwide since the agriculture agreement of the WTO took place, because agribusiness, taking very cheap product from the United States and Europe, where they have policies in place that make the taxpayers cover the difference between a fair price to the farmers and the world price, very low world price. The taxpayers are bailing out the farmers, but it's really agribusiness that's getting the advantage of those very low prices that are paid to the farmers. And then they take their cheap food products overseas and dump them either as commercial food or in some cases as food aid in countries that then drive their own farmers out of production because they can't compete in the marketplace in Zimbabwe or in Afghanistan or in China or in Argentina, name the country. All over the world, farmers are going out of business because of this cheap food policy that agribusiness benefits from, and that's also driving our own farmers bankrupt.
Let's talk about the World Summit on Sustainable Development specifically. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. And I imagine that you'll be hearkening back to your experiences from the Rio Summit, but I want you to kind of walk us through a day in your life at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, where you'll be in 2 weeks, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Yes. I can imagine that it will be very much like other summits that I have been to. So you usually stay in a pretty cheap hotel. You might have a couple of other people staying with you. A lot of people come to these places without hotel reservations and then rely on the generosity of others.
People like you.
The first one I went to, I just took my sleeping bag and ended up in a convent, actually. But thankfully now I'm well employed at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and I actually do get a reservation in advance. But sometimes I end up with others joining me in my hotel room because we want everybody to go, and there are shortages. So you get up pretty early, get some breakfast. A lot of hotels offer free breakfast in other countries. So you load up your pockets with all the free breakfast, and that's your lunch too. And then you head out to, usually there's an NGO meeting at about 8:30 or 9. You all gather in a particular corner of the convention center and just share information. Who heard what what happened yesterday. If the negotiators went until 2 o'clock in the morning, and there will often be many negotiations going on at the same time. For example, all the water discussions will be in conference room A, and in conference room B you'll have the biodiversity negotiations.
Of the country delegates
Yes.
will be in these
Yes.
negotiating rooms.
Conference room C will be where all the energy stuff is being talked about. Conference room D is where the global governance topics, the relationship of all these treaties to each other, and the relationship of the national governments to the international system, and the World Bank and the WTO, and how do they all fit in, the UN's role. So there's all these many different negotiations going on. So among the NGOs, we'll kind of assign delegations to follow those very, very closely. And so each morning, people will come back, oh, my particular little working group went until 3 in the morning, and they kicked me out because they were having very tense private negotiations and didn't want the NGOs to hear. But afterwards, I talked to the delegate from some country, and they filled me in the bathroom that what really happened is, and I took notes, and so here's what we know today. We're going to have to really be ready for the, whatever the particular problem might be, whether or not the countries are going to chip into a new fund to subsidize the big French water companies. And so you get reports back from the people assigned to follow these things very
And do you follow the global governance
That's the one that I
negotiations?
myself, yes.
What's global governance?
It's a term that refers to how decisions are getting made at the global level. All these different international treaties and institutions, each one has a different framework for decision making, all the way from making new policy to enforcing existing policy. And each one is different because different governments join in on them. So if the U.S. is left out of most of them but maybe joins one, then it's a different dynamic. If it's a treaty like, say, the climate change treaty, the governments that most care about climate change are actually the small island states. So, the Pacific Islands.
Because they're going to flood.
The Caribbean
with
Islands.
Global warming.
Right. So these are very tiny countries with very tiny economies and not a lot of political clout. But they work together and they bring united positions, and then they try to build a coalition among other governments and encourage the NGOs to support their positions to try to get a policy through. Mm-hmm. So amongst all the NGOs, people have all heard different little rumors and gotten little tidbits of leaked information from one of the governments perhaps, and so we share all that information. Then at 10 in the morning is when the government negotiations usually start officially. And so some of us will go, if we're monitoring the official talks, we'll go and sit quietly in the back with our notebooks and take notes and listen real closely for the nuances, and maybe sometimes pass a note, like if you say, gee, the Ethiopian government, I know that they're really, really interested in the biodiversity issue, and I have an idea. If we could only start talking about flowers instead of food, they might be able to get Colombia and Ecuador on board. I actually did this once a couple years ago.
And so you slip a note to the Ethiopian delegate?
Yep, and he said,
and they're open
well, I
to
never
this?
thought about flowers, but it's still biodiversity. It still requires, a very diverse gene pool. It still means that you don't want the corporations to control the crops through patenting. So over the lunch hour, Ethiopia and Colombia might have a little chat and suddenly say, hey, we have something in common here, even though it's a completely different sector that we're discussing.
And who are these delegates? The person from Ethiopia, was he or she a high-ranking official in the Ethiopian government, or how does that work?
Yes, in that case, he was a high-level scientist with a political assignment from the Environmental Protection Authority for the government of Ethiopia. It can vary a lot. The United States government generally sends a representative of the State Department as the head of delegation, but the United States also sends 20, 30, 40, even more representatives from all of the different agencies of our government, whereas Ethiopia can usually only send 1 or 2, or if it's a really important negotiation, 3 or 4 people. So there's also an imbalance in terms of how many meetings they can cover. If you have ongoing negotiations in conference rooms A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and Ethiopia only has 4 representatives, they're missing some very important conversations. So that's another one of the democratic issues that we're discussing a lot as an NGO community. How can we make all of these international global governance decision-making processes more fair and balanced so that the poorer countries really can participate just as actively and thoroughly as the richer countries. Democracy is one of these big global governance issues. Transparency is another. Sometimes the governments don't want us listening, like I said, and maybe, you never know, you can speculate that they're perhaps trading off different issues that aren't really what's on the table. I suspect that military policy is often brought into the discussions in some of these closed-door, real hardball moments, and of course it's not officially on the Johannesburg agenda, so they can't do that in a public setting. That's just speculation on my part, but it's not speculation that we get kicked out sometimes in the most delicate moments.
How do they do that? How do they
well,
tell you to
generally,
leave?
the UN policy is that the chairperson of each particular committee or working group has the discretion, and the chair will usually respond to the government negotiators present. So if any one country says, I'm a little uncomfortable having those guys listening to us, then the chair will say, whoop, sorry, pack up your notebooks and bye-bye. So then we go out and wait around in the hall and
wait for people to come out and report.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think we're at about 11 o'clock in your day now.
Okay, well, no, actually, this goes on from 10 to 1, where the official governments are in place. Some of us, NGOs, will go to the non-governmental events. Civil society is the term that we use to refer to all of the people of the world, because NGOs are a very organized thing. You're either part of an institute for this or that, but civil society is a more broad term that refers to all of the ways in which citizens can participate. They usually have a parallel event where, mostly for educational purposes, there will be meetings and seminars and speeches and workshops, and it's an opportunity to educate people about the issues. And also to develop political positions and say, okay, we're all going to demand that half of the people who have no sanitation should be served by 2015. When the Johannesburg meeting started about a year and a half ago, sanitation wasn't even on the agenda. So it was the NGOs participating at these preparatory meetings. There have been 4 or 5 preparatory meetings of a week or 2 each where the governments all get together and the NGOs all go too. So the Johannesburg is really the culmination of a 2-year process. Well, you could call it a 10-year process. Actually, there was the Stockholm Summit on the Environment of 1972, so maybe we could call it a 30-year process. But in any case, it all builds. And so the sanitation issue wasn't even on the agenda for Johannesburg originally, but it was because NGOs got together and said, whoa, this is very serious. It must be on the agenda. And then they did the kind of work that I'm describing to convince certain governments that they would, as government officials, propose that it be added to the agenda. And indeed, it has been. And indeed, by September 4th, we do expect that there will be an outcome on that issue. So that's from 10 to 1. Then there's a break from 1 to 3, lunch hour. Often we NGOs will organize workshops for the government delegates during the lunch hour. And it's a chance, again, for some of our experts to present our point of view and explain how we see the issues and what we expect them as our governments to do, taking responsibility. And sometimes it has an impact, and sometimes it just falls on deaf ears. We often will scrape from our own pockets to maybe provide some snacks or something, because the NGO seminars for the governments that actually provide food are definitely the more popular ones.
Of course. Whenever you provide food, more people come.
So it's just back and forth between all this. Then the afternoon sessions usually go from 3 till 6, and then at 6 o'clock usually the chairperson says, well, we didn't get anywhere near where we were supposed to get for our agenda today, so we're going to have to extend into the evening, and we'll start again at 7:30. Bang goes the gavel, and everyone goes and gets a bite to eat, comes back at 7:30, and then you can go till, quite literally, the first week of a 2-week meeting, usually go till 10 or 11. Second week, you start going till midnight or 1. The last night or 2, 3 or 4 in the morning sometimes, and it's amazing what deadlines can do. And usually the deadlines work for getting some kind of a decision at the end of these meetings as well.
So let's say I'm a person who's sitting here watching this in my New Brighton home, let's say, and I'm interested in this, I'm intrigued. How would I find out more about, or even could I participate in the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in a couple weeks? And a separate question is, why would I want to go? Why would I want to participate?
Well, it really changes your life. The first one I went to, and everyone I've ever spoken to who for the first time goes to one of these conferences, they come back absolutely transformed. They see the world differently. They never read a headline in the newspaper the same again. They have much better understanding of what the implications of our national policies when we hear about budget or the military or any of the decisions made in Washington. So just your own understanding really is greatly influenced. But also you can learn a lot and have a lot of fun and have an impact on the outcome.
Someone find out more about the proceedings as this summit goes on?
Well, the newspapers will probably give some coverage. In addition, they're most welcome to plug into our internet website, which we'll be following closely. We'll be having live interviews if they have the audio on their internet systems. We'll be having live speeches presented and so forth, daily updates. Our website is www.iatp.org. We also will be following the water issues very closely, and that one is www.waterobservatory.org. Mm-hmm. And as I say, the UN will also be they have a website where they can get a lot of the documents and read up on some of the official procedures. That's www.un.org.
And we have about a little less than 1 minute left, and I want you to tell someone who's out there who's wondering, well, I can't go to Johannesburg, but what else can I do? I'm concerned about these issues. What would you recommend in 40 seconds? First and foremost,
to think harder about the rest of the world with every decision that we make as individuals. So the food that we buy, the clothing that we wear, the cars that we drive, and what we teach our children. All of that could be different if we're always thinking about what is a just and equitable approach to sharing the resources of planet Earth.
Kristin Dawkins, thank you so much for joining us. This was wonderful.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.